Hey, welcome everyone to the afternoon policy panel session. I'm Lisa Eads with the Community College System Office, and I am very excited today to have a very engaging panel of experts joining us to share their thoughts about what's going on in the world of dual enrollment policy. So I'm going to start by asking Amy to introduce herself.
Thank you, Lisa. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. My name's Amy Williams. I'm the Executive Director of the National Alliance of Concurrent Enrollment Partnerships. I come from a background, I like to say I have worked in the continuum of the span of education that these programs covered. I spent about a decade in the high school, middle school classroom, did a turn as an administrator in the high school side of the space, helped to build and grow a program at a small two-year college, and then moved to the state and system level to do the same for the state as both state career and technical education director as well as dual enrollment director. So I'm delighted to be here and show kind of NASEP's look into the crystal ball about what's happening in the policy space at large. And I will hand over to a colleague, Alex Perry, who NASEP works very closely with the College and the High School Alliance.
Hey everybody, my name is Alex Perry. I work for a DC-based education policy consulting firm called Foresight Law and Policy, but I spend a solid 80 to 90% of my time working on behalf of the College and High School Alliance, which is a coalition of 90 national and state organizations who are advocating on behalf of equity, quality, and student success in policy for the grab bag of programs we call college and high school programs, your dual enrollment, concurrent enrollment, early college, high school, PTEX, et cetera, et cetera. We have a steering committee. It includes, so I have two of my bosses on this call. So NASEP is on my steering committee, Achieving the Dream is on my steering committee. So because Amy and Nick are here, I'm on best behavior from here on out. But we as a group engage on both the federal policy level and on the state policy level to really think about what are those policy levers to help expand access for underrepresented students in these programs, to think about how do we keep that quality really high, and how do we think about this not just as an access strategy, but also move students through to successful completion of these college experiences as well, and the role that policy can play in implementing that. And yeah, I guess Nick, since you're my other boss on the call, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Alex. I appreciate it. And I will say I didn't realize that you actually have a 1.5 playback mode built in. That's impressive. We'll cover a lot of ground today. My name is Nick Mathern. I'm the Executive Director of K-12 Partnerships for Achieving the Dream. Many of you, if you were with us yesterday morning, got a chance to hear from our president, Karen Stout, and she had a chance to kind of lay out our vision for a kind of new era for dual enrollment. And that's the area of work that I work on for Achieving the Dream. My background is that after having worked in alternative education for a number of years, I spent 15 years working on the Gateway to College model and leading the replication of Gateway to College programs around the country. And in 2019, Gateway to College National Network had the good fortune of merging with Achieving the Dream. So since that time, I've been working with my colleagues at Achieving the Dream to think in a more expansive way about how can we bring equity to dual enrollment and K-12 partnerships across the country. And one of the places where we've got a deep focus is in Massachusetts. And my work in Massachusetts brought me into contact with our wonderful colleague, Simone. So I will turn it over to Simone.
Thank you, Nick. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Simone. I am the Education Equity Fellow at Mass Inc. If you're not familiar with Mass Inc., it's a think and I like to call action tank in Boston. We work on an array of projects, a lot of education, transportation development, just anything related to the gateway cities in general. My work particularly focuses on school segregation measures, early college measures in Massachusetts, and how to make education more equitable in the Commonwealth as a whole. So it's great to be with you all here this afternoon, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you all so very much for those great introductions. And again, we're very just excited to have you as part of the panel today. So let's jump right into it. Dual enrollment can be a transformational program for students, especially our underserved students. And for many of us who work with dual enrollment, the program can seem more transactional due to some of the policies around program facilitation. So I'd like to hear from you all. What are some approaches and considerations for policy for dual enrollment that practitioners and policymakers should take into account to expand access to transform the students' lives? And I'm going to start with Nick.
Thanks, Lisa. I will say that we agree 100% that this can be transformational, and dual enrollment is tremendously powerful. We see that all the time, especially for students who have not been well served in traditional high school arrangements. But I agree, for many of us who are working on dual enrollment, some of the work seems transactional due to the policies around program facilitation. And I think that that's a real issue. But I think the issue is that it's transactional because of what we measure and what we pay for. So when we're measuring dual enrollment programs, we're really thinking about students enrolled in college courses. And that makes complete sense. It's very intuitive. But then really it comes down to managing the processes and also thinking about the funding. But there's two big limits with this kind of thinking. The first is that I think we heard a little bit about this yesterday when we were talking about meaningful pathways. If we're not actually able to impact the trajectory that students are on, then we're less likely to have a transformational impact on their path. And our current systems don't do a great job of making a differentiating between whether we've helped a student to earn credits in a specific career field that they're planning to pursue, or if they just happen to land in a class because their schedule put them someplace. And colleges or school districts, if they're being measured or if they're being paid for their participation in dual enrollment, they get recognized the same for both of those outcomes. And I think that that's something that we really need to address. I think the other fundamental issue, and I think this is one that really comes down to an equity issue, is that if we continue to provide opportunities to student populations who are already ready to take college coursework, then we're not really making a difference in terms of what our outcomes are. And if we can reimagine dual enrollment programs with a deeper investment on a smaller number of students and courses, but specifically focused on students who might not otherwise be on track to participate in dual enrollment, then I think we're going to actually have much more transformational impact, because we're going to change the outcomes for students who weren't headed to college. That might be a problematic proposal based on the current system, because colleges are funded based on the number of students enrolled. However, if we take a new orientation that invests in coaching and holistic supports for students and really pays attention to the readiness activities, I think that we can have a more transformational impact for many more students.
Yeah, I think that there's this, it's not like in the policy space for these programs, it's not difficult to convince a policymaker that like it's a good thing for a high school student to take a college course, right? Like we're blessed in that regard. It's very bipartisan. It's a real no-brainer, and the research is there behind why it matters. I think on the policy level, the real challenge is not like fostering more opportunities for high school students to take college courses. It's thinking about how the policy does that well, right? Like, and I think we can sometimes get really wrapped up in this funding question, but that's not necessarily the whole picture, right? I mean, funding is obviously ultimately, as Nick was kind of indicating, right? Like that's a big barrier to student access, but it's often not the only barrier. And so from the policy perspective, what we find is there are lots of states that they come at this laser focused and they start asking themselves the question, how do we create equity of access in dual enrollment? Well, let's just make it free. If we make it free, then we will magically get that kind of equitable participation of students. And the reality is, unfortunately, that's not the case. And we've seen in states that have tried that and tried nothing else, they still look at it and they go, well, hold on a second, we still have an inequitable population of students participating in these programs, because the other components of policy matter as well. Questions like, how is student readiness measured? How is student eligibility measured? Do school districts have sufficient qualified instructors to teach the courses if the courses are happening in the high school? Are there support services available for the students to ensure that they have a place they can go of someone who can help them kind of figure out what their journey through these courses is and should be? If we build a policy system, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't have a really strong focus on finance, right? Like, obviously, if it's not free, that is a key equity barrier that needs to be addressed, but it's not the only way of creating equity barriers. And if a lot of these policy systems that do just focus on making it free for students and don't address some of these other challenges, what we end up with is a free dual enrollment system that only the most privileged students can get into and take access and gain the benefits of. And so we've ended up putting a lot of money into a system that has not necessarily done anything to really actionably move forward, reducing those equity gaps. And so I think, unfortunately, the answer is it's complicated and there's a ton of work to be done in a ton of places, but that's really the only way to come at this.
Yeah, go ahead, Simone.
And just to bounce off Alex's point, I think a lot of what he speaks to is community engagement and policy, right? Because we're thinking about this technical side of policy without combining it with community engagement, because we're seeing here in Massachusetts that less than 2% of underserved students are enrolled in early college. And if we really want to close equity gaps, we need to have a viable plan for expansion, right? And that includes community engagement, and that includes much deeper than that, actually having parents engage in conversations to really scale these programs. Because similar to Alex's point, we're seeing that if we don't have that community engagement aspect, we're noticing that students who may already have had access to college and career readiness programs through family and through school funding and through these other mechanisms already have sort of another, like, it's already a stepping stool for them compared to our most underserved students. So if we really tackle policy with combining community engagement work, I think we would see more transformational policy as well, so.
That's actually great. I'll piggyback on that. When a lot of times when we're talking about policy manifests in a lot of different ways. There is, of course, statute and administrative rules and regulations. And a lot of that kind of focused policy is really on the accountability side, the tracking of funding side, the who participates and why side. But there are other elements of policy like institutional policy and policy that comes through training at the state level or the institution level. And I think that's a great opportunity to build a broader focus on the big picture idea of what are we trying to do and transform education through these programs, and how are we trying to reach these students. And so, we've seen some really innovative work with states that might have a very bare bones policy statement or framework that they're using, but they really use intentional, guided, targeted technical training and assistance with institutions and partnerships within the state to really try and make the message move forward about building populations that see themselves as college students outside of those students that are traditionally already served very well by these programs, right? Building outreach programs, transitioning marketing away from cautionary tales and language that doesn't speak to a diverse group of students towards this is inclusion of more student voice. This is why students might want to consider this, instead of saying this is what a successful dual enrollment student looks like. So we've seen some great workshops on marketing and messaging to be more broad, more inclusive, and more welcoming with the language to help with some of those parts that are less policy oriented. How do we get students to feel that they are ready to take this step and that this is for them, if this is a totally new experience in their life?
That is just wonderful feedback. And just with that in mind, let's jump to our next question. From your all's perspective, how do you see dual enrollment programs positively impacting educational attainment and impacting the overall economy of each state in our nation? And thinking about a lens of equity, how can dual enrollment be leveraged to increase equitable outcomes for higher education, persistence, and completion? And I think I'll start this time with Alex.
Yeah, I think, as we heard at the research panel this morning, right, the research is really strong on telling us that students who have access to college courses while they're in high school are more likely to access college, and they're more likely to complete college. And I think in this moment in particular, that is a particularly powerful model and a powerful tool for addressing some of the challenges that we're facing in this post-COVID environment, right? What are we looking at on the post-secondary side? Significant declines in post-secondary enrollment. We're looking at some really troubling warning signals on the horizon around post-secondary completion. And there's obviously a big conversation around what kind of accelerated learning is necessary for students who are still in K-12 to ensure that their onward career and post-secondary trajectories have not been negatively impacted by the COVID experience over the last 18 months. And I sort of really see these programs as being one of the tools in the toolbox to think about how do we address and how do we meet this particular moment, right? I mean, even pre-pandemic, obviously we know that in the modern economy, most students are going to require some kind of post-secondary education. And so programs like this that help get those students onto a post-secondary pathway towards completion, right? Again, the research says students who have access to these programs more likely to go to college, more likely to complete college, and that's controlling for things like prior academic performance, other demographic factors, right? We know there is something about these programs specifically that helps improve those metrics for students. And so as we're looking at these challenges, like this idea of something is happening in between high school graduation day and college matriculation day, where a number of students who 3-4 years ago would have made that transition are falling off. And so this idea of how do we kind of pull this college experience into the high school to give those students the ability to experience college course taking, to understand the onward possibility of post-secondary education for college and career success. I think that, that's not going to be right for every student under all circumstances, but I think there are a lot of students right now who, because of all the challenges that they're facing, because of COVID, because of some of the economic circumstances we've had over the last 18 months, are not seeing that value proposition of post-secondary education. And I think one of the tools for helping them find that again is to provide those supported environments in which to expose students to college, because we know that that is really going to positively benefit their onward college journey.
I think that, I agree 100%. I think that, we can think about what Alex was talking about in two kind of categories. The first is, the work that dual enrollment has been doing already for a decade or so, by lowering costs and by giving students an opportunity to take classes in high school. You reduce the melt between students who are likely to matriculate and those who actually do, right? So we increase the likelihood that students attend and that they complete, because we've seen the research that shows that that's what dual enrollment does. It's good and sensible policy. It turns maybes into yeses when it comes to credential attainment. But I think that on the equity side, this is where we really have the opportunity to move us from maybe 1 or 2% a year increasing post-secondary attainment rates to bigger jumps. If we go out and we specifically, as Alex is talking for, do targeted outreach to communities who aren't there. And this is where I think in the dual enrollment world, we need to expand our circles. We need to start thinking about other education models. Yesterday you heard my President Karen talk about Gateway to College, and she also talked about a program in Central Oregon called Avanzo, where they do specific culturally focused outreach to Native, that's a Latinx program, and then they have another Good Road where they do outreach to Native youth, and they bring them in specifically for dual enrollment opportunities. In Washington State, there's a re-engagement model called Open Doors, which re-engages out-of-school high school students, and one of the recommended pathways is a college-based pathway. And I think that as a dual enrollment community, we need to start going into the alternative education community and recognizing that our goals are the same. And so we can do, I think, have more impact if we work together. And we need to be really deliberate about expanding our work. I mean, yeah, Simone, I don't know if this is where this kind of overlaps. report that you wrote for Mass Inc. about the need to scale early college in Massachusetts, I think speaks right to this.
Yeah, a lot of what I wanted to touch on really in terms of equity and scaling up early college has to do with the pathways, right? So we know that with dual enrollment in early college, there are several pathways that students can take based on their interests. These turn into majors later on at 2- and 4-year institutions, but things like liberal arts, health, and then we saw great jumps in education, particularly if we want to see more students of color and more low income or underrepresented students, we want to leverage these pathways to really in order to scale it up, make sure that these students, whatever pathways they're taking, and if it wants to transfer to higher education, seeing more Black and brown, more low income students, for example, the education pathway, having more educators of color transfer into higher education and really see them, make them more of a presence in higher education. We know that it is a powerful intervention for students of color, and that with Black and Hispanic students particularly, we're seeing a 30% jump with Black students who participate in early college and dual enrollment programs, and a nearly 20% jump with Hispanic students. So we know that in order to scale it up, with our pathways and with potential majors, making sure that we see these numbers, making sure that these students know that it's attainable and that it will create long-term goals and long-term successes for them in these career fields as well. So.
Yeah, and I'll just add to Nick's comment about needing to expand our circles that we work within. So when I spent time as a state CTE director, really, I'm obviously a big champion for dual enrollment, love that work, but there's a lot bigger space that these programs play in and can play in when you start folding in pathways and great opportunities, additionally great opportunities like work-based learning that's very strategic and targeted for students and has real finite outcomes, and things like industry recognized credentials and certifications. So when I hear higher ed and post-secondary education talk about those, and they talk about them as how they can be built into a pathway to give really students that full benefit of experiences that can help them figure out, do some course finding, and then help them take a step on whatever is next after high school, I get really excited about that space because I think that is an area that we can fold in some real high value opportunities for students. And then that reflects back to the communities that people are working in to move forward, that yes, this is a program that has real solid outcomes and it creates more options for students after high school instead of narrow, finite options.
I think that's just wonderful, and just helping our students think about all the options and helping them know about those options. I think that's a real challenge sometimes. Before we move to our next question, I just want to remind our audience that if you have questions for our panelists, please go ahead and start entering those into the chat. We will get to those as we can. So let's continue. The next question I have for you is, are there policies that should be considered to guide our collaborative partnerships? So really thinking about the partnerships that make this work possible to ensure student access, equity, and success. And with that, what are any accountability policies that need to be considered for our dual enrollment programs to make sure that we are best serving students in providing that return on all the investments made? And I think this time I'm gonna start with Simone.
Yeah, sure. So one thing that we're really talking about in Massachusetts right now is SOA, or Student Opportunities Act. And there has been a big commitment for educators and for districts to use SOA dollars to leverage access to opportunities for our most vulnerable student populations. And a lot of the discussion has been surrounding early college and 2- to 4-year pathways for students, and increasing educator diversity. So I think that's a step in the right direction, is really having these conversations about like literally putting our money where our mouth is and saying, hey, we see that this is a problem in our state. We want to do something about it. How we use those dollars, I think, would be best to increase educator diversity and really ensure that these early college pathways, once students are enrolled, can transfer to any 2- or 4-year institution. Because I think right now with SOA dollars and with early college, particularly in our state, we see that students are able to transfer to state colleges in Massachusetts, but even go a step beyond that and say, hey, if you want an opportunity to go elsewhere, to go outside of your state, or to go to a school that maybe doesn't have a partnership with a Massachusetts community college, we can make that happen for you. So I think this is a step in the right direction, is saying, okay, we want to create more of a presence with Black and Brown students, create more opportunities for educator diversity, but even take it a step further and say, you know, beyond our walls, including being in Massachusetts, you also have opportunities elsewhere. We're going to make that possible for you. So.
Yeah, I'll add a bit of a different spin. A lot of these policies live at the high level in states, or sometimes in systems as well. We see a lot of policy there. But we know that the program work really happens at the local level. And when we see these partnerships truly evolve to have targeted objectives that they're working towards, it's because there is a strong partnership. And so we do see good statute and good policy that requires partnership, but there is a difference between sitting next to someone at a meeting and sitting next to someone in a meeting, agreeing to roll up your sleeves, agreeing to collect data and share data, agreeing to come back and revisit that and see how you're moving the metrics as well. So I think a lot of this, and institutions are in a great space in terms of having ownership of their data that they can share with high schools. High schools are in the great space to be asking partner institutions about how are our students doing? What do our equity metrics look like? Are we serving the same population in our dual enrollment program as we are serving in our general high school? And if not, what gaps are we seeing, and what are the priorities and strategies for addressing that? So I think a lot of that lives in the partnership space, but the policy opens up and untethers or creates opportunities, we'll say, to build those partnerships. But really all of that work exists boots on the ground, and it requires collaboration, commitment, and consistency.
I think accountability systems matter particularly in two ways. One, I think that they help contextualize what we're ultimately trying to get out of doing this, right? Like, it is very easy in this space to become solely access minded, which is really, I mean, it's really important to be really focused on access because we know there are lots of students who don't have it. But it's also really important to focus on the back end too, right? It's not just about how many students are we getting into the courses, it's also about how many students are walking away from those courses, having been successful and having gotten that momentum built up for their onward college and career journeys. And I think sometimes accountability systems can push a little bit closer towards the, well, all we're really caring about is how many kind of, you know, butts are in seats versus what did this actually do to help these students propel them towards college and career success? And I think that also ends up being a critically important dynamic of this conversation around, you know, I think all of us kind of look at dual enrollment and say, gee, I wish there was a lot less kind of random acts of dual enrollment, right? Students who are kind of loading up on these courses that aren't necessarily part of an intentional pathway towards degrees or credentials. And the accountability systems and the funding systems and the way that those are governed really do help in terms of guiding and providing those guardrails for programs in terms of offering those choices to students, right? Because I think we've unfortunately very quickly fall into the mentality of, well, it was the student's fault they took, you know, those particular courses they did. And if there's anybody whose fault that it's not, right, it's the students. It's a fault of the programs, it's a fault of the counseling, it's a fault of the systems that live around them. And at the top, it's a fault of the policy that governs all of those behavioral choices that get made right down to the student. And so the way I think about accountability systems and the way they function as part of this is they really set the direction to say, what's the vision, what's the goal, what is it we're trying to accomplish? And it's really important that those accountability systems are able to articulate in a really kind of cohesive way exactly what dual enrollment is meant to provide to students, to help the programs understand what those outcomes are supposed to be so they can make their choices, to help the counselors understand what those outcomes are so they can make their choices about what to tell students, so students can have the best set of information possible in order to then make a determination about what the right, course selections would be for them, how that fits into their kind of, long-term kind of journey. And I think the last thing to say too is it's when we talk about intentional dual enrollment, it's not about forcing students to make career choices when they're 16, right? Like, I wanted to be an astronaut when I was 16, I do this now. But what it is about, it's about providing students those options and ability to try things and make selections and change their mind along the way, but be moving towards a something, right? There should always be an end goal in mind, a something in mind, with recognition that for a lot of these students, it is sort of a tree, and they're gonna take various different pathways along that journey to where they want to get to, and they might change halfway through, but at least it exists, and at least it's ultimately moving in a certain direction.
I appreciate what you're saying, Alex, and I will say I was eager to jump in and join your response, although I was distracted by your 16-year-old ambitions. And I just want to let the group know that Alex he is an astronaut on the weekends, so you can ask him about that. But this is so important. This accountability question is so important, and it requires some nuance, but it also, I think requires just some thoughtfulness about understanding the tension. And there is an appropriate tension between having some accountability and wanting to make sure that students are successful, and at the same time making sure that doesn't push us to be overly conservative, right? So we want to protect students' SAP, or satisfactory academic progress, and therefore we don't want to irresponsibly give folks an opportunity to just do whatever they want. But we also want to make sure that we are taking responsibility for the fact that how ready students are is a product of the system that we put them in for the previous 10 to 12 years. And so, for example, yesterday we talked a little bit about GPA and eligibility requirements, and I saw that Stacy asked the same question again today. And so, Stacy, your question is going to the top of the list because we didn't get to it yesterday morning. And there are a handful of states that have some type of an eligibility requirement, either a minimum GPA that is required to participate in dual enrollment, or in some cases a cut score. There's about there's about a dozen or so states that have a minimum GPA requirement, and then another 10 or so states that have a required cut score on a test. And that can be productive. And actually that's certainly in flux, especially because of COVID. Some states have gone to multiple measures. And so some states that perhaps used to have a cut score have now gone to GPA. And so that number may have shuffled somewhat in the last year, and that will probably stay shuffled until people can get back to having students sit for AccuPlacer tests or the like. And maybe if you don't think that we should, then you should tell your state policymakers that you want more opportunities and you don't want us to see us kind of confounding students' eligibility. Now, those policies are put in place in some cases to protect students so a student who maybe isn't as prepared doesn't take a class, fail it, and then hurt their availability or their eligibility for aid later. But there are things we can do, right? That doesn't mean that we have to throw up our hands and say, okay, a student with below a 2.0, you can't do this. Like, why don't we have accountability policies that give greater credit to schools who move a student who maybe in the 9th or 10th grade was in the bottom quartile of their class, and by the 11th or 12th grade successfully participated in a dual enrollment course? A school that makes that opportunity happen should be better evaluated than a school who gets a bunch of students with a 3.5 to successfully complete a class, because those students are going to be college ready almost certainly with or without. So I think that we just have to really think about this in a nuanced way, understanding that when we make a policy, we don't want it to have a negative other effect, right? So we don't want to just kind of throw open the doors and not be cautious about it, because we do want to protect students, but at the same time, we don't want to protect students by not giving them opportunities.
think that's all really important information. I have another question for you all, thinking about dual enrollment over time. In North Carolina, we've had dual enrollment kind of officially on the books and policy since the early 80s. And of course, our policy and programs have evolved throughout our state. So what things have you seen change over time in dual enrollment policies in your work? And I'll start this time, I think, with Amy.
Thank you. Boy, I hope that our panelists can kind of keep their remarks constrained, because I think we can go in a lot of directions with this. I think there has been generally a movement towards policy and away from not having policy. So like granting and blessing the fact that these programs can occur, because we all know they're incredibly complex because they join two systems and institution types that are separated in time and space. They have different accountability, they have different oversight mechanisms, different funding mechanisms. So we see policy be a lot more intentional to, I think, really more of the transactional elements of it. So who can participate? How are we outlining that? How is it being paid for and who pays for it? I think the thing that, and I'm sure Alex can springboard off of this, I think the thing that concerns me the most in the policy space that I've seen change is the lack of the practitioner's voice at the table and the unintentional consequences of that. Because ultimately practitioners, institutions, high schools, counselors or teachers are going to be the ones ultimately making these programs move forward. So when there's a disconnect with policymakers and they don't fully understand this very complex mixed space that we live in, this both and space that practitioners live in, there can be all the best intentions in the world, but we can see things go awry. And I think there are some really good examples, particularly in the funding space of this, where we see programs really blow up because of demand, pent up demand for this. Students get access to it, tuition is removed, and we see rapid growth of these programs. Well, if the state is funding for that, that has a price tag associated with it. And that price tag and the growth of that price tag might not have been anticipated. So then we see things like caps that are put on the number of courses that students can take. We see increased levels of GPA required or cut scores required to participate in order to compress that budget element. When we could look, if you wanted to preserve the same amount of money that was being used prior to it getting really popular, you could instead look at playing with eligibility for the kind of points that Nick's made. Who's got the most ability to benefit? Who is this going to ultimately change their lifelong trajectory for? Who truly can't afford it, that the state could use to backfill that tuition instead of just blanket covering tuition cost for any and all takers. Being very strategic and targeted can help decrease those bubble areas and decrease the impact of them without inadvertently, and I have to believe that it's inadvertent when these changes come through, inadvertently depressing the opportunities for the students that could most benefit from this. Like NASEP tries to work, we work in the policy space at both states and federal, and really our crux of our work is trying to bring the practitioner voice into policy conversations. And I guess I can kick over to Alex if he wants to add anything on that, because I teed you up early and then talked.
For any Lord of the Rings fans out there, it feels to me like we're entering the third age of dual enrollment. So the first age kind of ran from like your 80s to the early 2000s, which is very much a, actually ran till sort of the 2010 time, which is sort of proof of concept, right? This is an idea, people are sort of exploring it. A lot of the work is very much focused on the individual program level of like figuring out, is there something that's worth pursuing? Is there something that's worth doing? The data, the research base starts to build up. And then when we hit the 2010s, we sort of move from proof of concept to implementation, right? The last 10 years of dual enrollment policy, I think, has very much been categorized by a push by states to do more, right? And when you're coming from a very low floor, then more is better, right? And more is always better when the comparison point is zero. And so we've seen these states push for more. And we're now at the point where, regardless of which state you're in, and regardless of how much dual enrollment state policy there is in that state, there's a lot of dual enrollment, right? Compare and contrast a state like Ohio, which has a fair amount of state policy on the books for dual enrollment, and a state like Arizona, which has almost nothing in the books in terms of state policy. There's still a lot of dual enrollment happening in the state of Arizona. Even if you look at the state policy level, you don't necessarily see much that would indicate that it is. And so dual enrollment is here to stay. And right, like it is now a permanent feature of our secondary and post-secondary systems. It's not going to undo itself at any point, right? And I think that the challenge over the next decade is going to be for us to kind of maybe move a little bit away from the more is more mentality. Obviously, there are big equity gaps still to address, right? There are too many students for whom access is at zero, and more is better. And we need to put a ton of effort into making sure that those students get their access. But according to CCRC analysis of the Office for Civil Rights data collection around dual enrollment, 1 in 5 dual enrollment programs already have equitable participation of students. And so for those programs, right, I think, and for the field as a whole, I think it's really important for us to start teasing out the answer to the question of what is it we're moving towards here, right? What is the end stage for dual enrollment? What's the point at which we go, this has reached its natural level of equilibrium and we're comfortable with where it is now, and that's where it's going to stay for the foreseeable future? And I think that is going to require a really intense set of conversations amongst the field, both on the policy and the practice level, to say, what is it that we're ultimately trying to achieve by doing this? Because there's going to come a point at which, right, and I think we're there for a number of students where there's no value to them taking even more college credits on top of what they're already taking. And I think we as a field need to reach a level of confidence of saying this much dual enrollment is enough. At this point, you have maxed out your benefits for each individual student for participating in these programs, and more is no longer better for this student. And I think that is the direction that policy, both, that's how it's evolved in my mind over the last 3 decades, and where I think this decade we need to turn is I think we need to figure out, like, what is that stable state end point for what we want this to be, where we can just say, that's it, we're good, we don't need more at this point.
Alex, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but I'm going to also suggest something that maybe is somewhat divergent, although I think it's going in a direction that we've talked about, and I think that we are in general agreement about, which is that this trajectory and this evolution of this partnership between K-12 systems and post-secondary systems is moving in a way that one possible outcome of where we land is a place where the boundary between K-12 and post-secondary is much more blurred, and in fact may eventually get dissolved altogether, right? So I appreciate your sense of that history, and I think of the history is in much simpler ways, but the same kind of general scope, which is that when dual enrollment was a concept that was not particularly well kind of regulated by policy or administered in a particularly uniform way, it gave a lot of opportunities to students, like students in our Gateway to College programs. And as states bolstered their dual enrollment policies, one of the things that happened was some of the students that we were enrolling in Gateway to College programs who had a high school GPA of below 2.0 were now all of a sudden not eligible to participate. And so sometimes, as you indicate, those policies actually cut off some of our intended impact. But I think that as we move forward to this potential new state, and I was appreciating that I heard it this morning from Julie Edmonds in the research panel, that there is a future perhaps where there really isn't a clear boundary between secondary and post-secondary, and that will allow us, I think, to get more serious about funding the supports needed for the students who aren't currently ready, right? Because if we're focused on the students who are about to take a college class, then we're very close to the boundary between these two systems. And I think that what we need to do is we need to have the post-secondary go deeper into the secondary system and work with those students who aren't near the periphery, who need more support to get ready.
Yeah, and just to touch upon Alex's point, I think that one thing we're finding in Massachusetts is that although we are increasing early college and dual enrollment programs, we're finding that we're not scaling it at the capacity in which we would like, but also we've come a long way, you know? Right now we have more than 35 designated early college programs, but the hiccup we're finding is that the minimum requirements to take are 12 credits, but there's not a maximum, right? So some students are graduating with 12 credits that are transferable, and then other students are graduating with an associate's degree's worth of college credit. So really finding that balance when it comes to how we're scaling and how we're looking at early college programs, like what is that end goal? Again, like Alex said, is it for students to have enough college credit to be transferable for what, one semester's worth of a 2-year or 4-year degree? Or is it to leave with an associate's degree worth of credits to transfer then on to a 4-year institution? So
I think that's a good point. I think at North Carolina, we struggle with some of that same conversation about the number of credits and really getting that return on investment for things like our CCP and early college programs. We were getting some questions here in the chat from our audience. I want to thank the folks that are entering those questions. We'll start with Christine's question. I think, Nick, you addressed Stacy's GPA question. Is there anything else you want to add for that, or are we ready to take Christine?
I think let's keep moving.
Okay, let's keep rolling. So Christine has asked, what foundational pieces of legislation do you feel has helped shape the legislation for early college in general, and more specifically in Massachusetts? So Simone, you want to start us off?
I'm sorry, you cut off there, my Wi-Fi.
I'm sorry. I don't know if you can see Christine's question in the chat. She's asking about early college legislation and more specifically in Massachusetts.
Yeah, so with early college legislation in Massachusetts, the recent budget, we've been lobbying for a few months for an increase in the line item for more funding for early college in our state, and we recently received our ask. But again, with the dual enrollment and now just an increase in funding to be able to scale it in the capacity in which we'd like, we recently just received an increase in funding. So I think moving forward for the next academic year, I think we're looking at an increase in early college enrollment in the gateway cities and in districts. And hopefully within the next year, just seeing more than the 2% of underserved students that we're seeing enrolling in early college increase drastically. So yeah, besides SOA dollars and an increase in funding, I think looking forward, we recently just received new funding or an increase in funding from our ask. So I think looking into the next school year, we really just want to see it scale up. The state has announced that they think an equitable measure for early college would be at least 16,000 students enrolled in early college. We think it should be more than double that. So within the next 5 to 10 years, we hope to see that number doubled, because in order to touch our most vulnerable, most underserved students, I think that 16,000 students enrolled in early college isn't a feasible number. We would need more for us to have a greater turnaround and see more equitable change in our in Massachusetts early college system.
Thank you for that, Simone. We're getting close to our time. I want to see if Alex, you want to address the Pell question quickly, and if we have time, we'll do a 30-second lightning round for last words before we close it out.
Yeah, in terms of what's happening with the idea of expanding dual enrollment eligibility, Pell eligibility to include dual enrollment, the department's experiment is ending at the end of this academic year. I think they've gotten about as much as they're going to get out of that experiment. They're now turning to evaluation to look at what the kind of consequences of the experiment were. The College and High School Alliance has a proposal for a new early college Pell experiment, which our federal policy working group put together. You can find that on our website at collegeandhighschool.org. We're advocating to the department for them to include that in their next budget request. I will be honest though, I think Pell for dual enrollment is a long-term play. I would not expect it to be something that happens within the next 1, 2, maybe even 5 years.
I'm going to go ahead and jump in for the lightning round on Maggie's question. She's asking about struggling with eligibility for students and having to demonstrate college readiness. That is a huge issue around the country. I mentioned that there's a certain number of states that have a GPA requirement or a test cut score requirement. Everywhere, though, it's required to demonstrate readiness according to the institution's standards. In many cases, that just simply doesn't happen in a way that is available to the students who really can be benefiting, especially from like a hands-on CTE course where they're not academically inclined in a regular high school, but they can thrive in those. And we really have to push for innovative local partners and innovative local leaders. So if you've got a superintendent or a dean or a vice president who's willing to take a chance, you can advocate with state agencies to say, hey, give us an opportunity to demonstrate a special partnership where we can show you the impact that these students can have, and you can do a lot with those.
That is wonderful. I'm afraid we've run out of time, and I wanted to just thank our panelists again for all that you have contributed today. Thank you, Michelle and Katie, for running our host features. We are capturing the chat, so if we have follow-up, we will certainly get back to the group. So again, thank you all for your time. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and we'll see you online soon. Thank you all.
Thank you.